We are going through the Bible, and go ahead and pass out the Bibles, make sure everybody's got one. We're on Acts chapter 17. How long have we been on the book of Acts? It's been... Psalms was 3 years. Yeah, that was a long time. That's a big book. But it's been a long time, and we're on Acts chapter 17. These are the baby pictures of the church, and this is the church at its most active and getting started and getting rolling. We're going to look today at fatherhood. And Jesus' word for father was Abba, and that's Abba in Hebrew there, and Aramaic, it's the same word, Abba, which means father. And if Jesus described the creator of the universe as father, it's something we need to pay attention to on Father's Day. And today's question is, who's your daddy? And your choice is Caesar or Christ. And we're going to look at the contrasting models for fatherhood and how the Bible presents an alternative to Caesar, an alternative to an oppressive fatherhood, a strong and servant-oriented fatherhood. Because fatherhood is under attack right now. And if you don't believe it, this morning I got my Orange County Register. And the title page has a dad there, but it doesn't honor dads. It says Father's Day reality check. Dads could give weird advice. And it talks about how some people have good feelings about their fathers, but 80% of us didn't have fathers like that, and they just gave us stupid advice. That's on the cover. Now, can you imagine if that had happened on Mother's Day? 80% of mothers are stupid. It would be riots in the street, I can imagine. But it's fair game to go after fathers, to go after dads, and to put down dads. It happens in lots of TV ads and everything else. And fatherhood is on the retreat. So we want to look through the Bible for solid models of fatherhood and what the Lord has in mind with that. And we just happen to have a passage which deals with it directly. I find it just fascinating how the Lord lines up these topics to go with things like Father's Day, of all things. So we have Paul and his gang of four, which is Timothy, Silas, Paul, and the reporter who's going along with them, the ace reporter Luke, and they are on their second missionary journey. If you look at the map above, Troas and Ephesus there are in Asia, and all of the other cities are in Europe. Last week, we talked about Philippi and the church that Paul started in Philippi with Lydia and her family, and how that was a Roman town, and how they didn't have a synagogue and all that stuff. And then today we're going to talk about, Paul going through Amphipolis, Apollonia, and ending up in Thessalonica. You've seen the books in your Bible, Thessalonians. And he wrote 2 letters to the Thessalonians. And the reason he wrote them is he only spent a very short amount of time there, probably 3 weeks. And so in 3 weeks, he set up a church and he was run out of town. So he had to write back and give them some more advice about how to do church because he really didn't have a chance to get things established. Can you imagine just 3 weeks to start a church and then just leave? And these people never heard about Jesus, and now they're running the church. And he's writing back to them in the books of Thessalonians. So you have the gang of four going from Philippi to Thessalonica and teaching in the synagogue in Thessalonica. We're in Acts 17, by the way, if you want to turn to that, Acts 17. So he's teaching in the synagogue as opposed to Philippi, because in Philippi there was no synagogue because it was a Roman town. But this was a Greek/Jewish town, and there was a synagogue. So he goes in and he teaches for 3 weeks. And he teaches that it's necessary for the Messiah to suffer, die, and rise again, which went over well with some people and not so well with others. The people that were receptive were the God-fearers, it says in there, and not a few prominent women. Paul was really good with these 2 groups. Paul would go into synagogues, and in the synagogue, there were basically 3 kinds of people. There were the tribal Jews, the real Jewish people, the people with all the stuff. You got to be born into it. You really can't become one. You're from one of the 12 tribes. You're part of this tribal, national, cultural Judaism. You've been circumcised, you eat kosher, the whole thing. There's those folks in the synagogues. There's also the God-fearers. The God-fearers were Romans and Greeks who got tired of their religion because their religion was really pretty stupid. It was sort of a dog and pony show in the sky with Zeus and all these other gods up there, and it was kind of a soap opera, and they weren't very well behaved, and it wasn't that interesting, and most people with a high IQ in the Roman Empire quit believing in it. They just didn't believe it anymore. And so they were drawn to Judaism, which was a highly developed spiritual system, much more highly developed than the Roman and Greek one. And so the God-fearers would hang around the synagogue and they'd listen to the teaching, but they couldn't really become Jews. You can sort of become a Jew, but not really. It's hard to become one. It's like becoming Italian if you're not Italian. It's tough to do that, to make that jump over into Judaism. So there was the tribal Jews, the God-fearers, and the third group was professional, high IQ women. And Paul had a big draw with them because he was also a high IQ traveling executive business guy with a lot of persuasive power. And the Romans had a patriarchal system which made it really hard for women. And so he presented a Christianity which was much more egalitarian, which was extremely attractive to professional women. And so they often, like Lydia in our last chapter, would be drawn to that because Christianity was seen as a way out of this system, a way to be in a more egalitarian system. It still works in India, by the way. Missionaries, where there's a caste system, the people that are drawn to it are the people that are held back by the caste system because they want to be in an egalitarian kind of system. In Malaysia, where I've done some missionary work in Malaysia, it's a Muslim country, and the two groups that are most drawn to Christianity are skateboarding teenage boys because they're kind of rebellious against that sort of Islamic thing, and professional women who get held down by the system. So there's these three groups. Two of the groups lean into what Paul's saying. Can you guess which ones they are? The God-fearers and the women. Who's upset with what he's saying? The tribal Jews, the exclusivists, the ones that us and them. We are the insiders, they're the outsiders. We're the Jews, they're the Gentiles. We're the spiritual ones, they're the pagans. Those folks didn't like him because he was opening up Jewish wisdom to the whole world. That was Paul's mission, to take the best of biblical wisdom and make it available to the whole human race. Who thinks that's kind of a big mission statement for your life? But he was able to bring it across the line for everyone else, which is a really big deal. The tribal Jews riot because they feel threatened. Their exclusivity is going to end if Paul gets his way, so they riot. And Jason, who was a local there, he was the Lydia of Thessalonica. So in Philippi, Lydia led the house church, and in Thessalonica, Jason was the one who hosted it. And they were hanging out at Jason's house, and they mobbed the house, drag him out, bring him before the courts, and throw him in jail for upsetting the system. And Paul was a person who, everywhere he went, he upset the system. He was just a walking time bomb whenever he went into any town because he had that sort of disruptive, explosive kind of nature to him. And they got hauled into court, and a whole bunch of things happened. Now here's the court's situation, Acts 17:7. And Jason welcomed them into his home. This is what they're accusing. The tribal Jews are saying this. They're accusing Jason of this. And Jason has welcomed them into his home. They're all guilty of treason against Caesar, for they profess allegiance to another king named Jesus. Now let that lean against your head for a second. We're going to talk about Caesar fatherhood versus Jesus fatherhood, and how Jesus has a different model for fatherhood than Caesar, and how the biblical model is actually the natural model that human beings were designed to follow. And Jason has welcomed them to his home. They're all guilty of treason against Caesar, for they profess allegiance to another king named Jesus. Caesar versus Jesus. People say, do you think so-and-so is the Antichrist? Antichrist also occurs in plural form in the Bible. Antichrists. It's a plural. There have been lots of antichrists. People who put themselves in the place of God are antichrists. Kim Jong-un. Kids are brought up in North Korea believing him to be a god, believing him to be perfect. They teach kids that he doesn't have to go to the bathroom, that he's given that up, that he does everything perfectly. And he's taken that place of God. He is an antichrist. Hitler was a total antichrist. You've heard the phrase Heil Hitler. Heil in German is salvation. Salvation through Hitler. And you've heard of the millennium in the book of Revelation? Well, he just wanted to hijack it and says, we're going to have a 1,000-year Reich. We're going to have a 1,000-year millennium, starting with me. And so he put himself in the position of Christ. Pharaoh. I'm translating the book of Exodus for the Passion Translation right now, and I found something just fascinating. When Moses and Aaron are going after Pharaoh with the plagues, you know, the whole thing, Pharaoh also, like Kim Jong-un, told his people he didn't have to eat and he didn't have to use the bathroom because he was a god. And he would sneak down to the river and relieve himself. And that's where Moses and Aaron would meet him in his shame. Just to say, we found you here, and by the way, another plague is coming. Which, little things you find out when you're translating the Bible. But Pharaoh put himself in the position of God. So does Kim Jong-un. So did Hitler. These are people who are antichrists. And today we're going to look at Caesar-type fatherhood, Caesar-type leadership, and Jesus-type leadership, and Jesus-type fatherhood. The Roman Empire was extremely patriarchal. Extremely patriarchal. They gave us a lot of good things. They gave us concrete, they gave us engineering, they gave us aqueducts, they gave us hot and cold running water. They gave us a lot of good things. But they were extremely patriarchal. The word for house in Latin is domus, your domicile. From that we get the word dominus, domination and dominion. And the paterfamilias, the main guy in the extended family, was the law, period. And what he said went, and everyone else in the family was his property. The word is res, res, the things that were his, including the children, the wives, and the slaves. So the idea of domination and telling people what to do and giving orders is a very Roman thing. And this was the rule in the Roman Empire. Jesus had a different plan, and we're going to talk about that. And this is why it caused a riot, because Paul was upsetting the system. Paul was upsetting the Roman system, which was based on giving orders. And anthropologists tell us in all tribal societies, going way back, people had two fundamental rights. Can you imagine back in the world of a couple thousand years ago where there's not that many people, there's lots of room? There were two fundamental rights in virtually every tribal society. Sure, you had a chief, but the chief had very little power because you had two fundamental rights. One of them was you could reject a direct order. You could say no. If the chief forced you to do something, you could say no. And the other one was, if you didn't like it, you could go somewhere else. You had the right mobility. Go across the hill, live next to another river. There was plenty of room. And over time, people started setting up these dominant structures, like the Romans, that got rid of those rights. The right to say no. The right to refuse an illegitimate order. The right to say, no, I'm not going to do that just because you want me to do it. Now, you can tell people they can't do certain things, like you can't kill, you can't murder, you can't steal. That's fine, but you can't tell them they have to do something. There's a difference there. And you could say, no, I'm not going to do that. You can't make me do that. And kids know that. What do they say on the playground? You can't make me. That's part of our human nature. And these dominant structures have started to creep in over time, telling us what we have to do. Who thinks we had some trouble with that in the pandemic? We had a whole bunch of rules coming down, and do people have the right to say no or not? And this is getting at basic human nature. Isn't this fascinating what's in these Bible passages? It really is. A famulus is a house slave, from which we also derive the word family, the people who have to do stuff, and the kids are like slaves, and so are the wives. Now you can see why the professional women were drawn to Christianity, because they wanted out of that system. The pater familias was in charge of the whole thing, and he gave orders, and those orders went, and he could kill anyone in the family who didn't do what he said. He could extend the death penalty to anyone in the family. The reign of Tiberius Caesar, he was the first one to say, you can't torture them when you kill them, you just have to kill them quickly. So he was lightening it by then. So if you didn't do what the Father says, he can kill you. That's just how that worked. So there's domination systems. We set up this country to try to get away from domination systems. We tried to put that together, and it's still a work in progress, isn't it, as we're working this out. But Jesus, this is Mark 10:42, if you want to look at that. Jesus called them to himself and said to them, you know that those who are considered rulers over the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. Yet it shall not be so among you. But whoever desires to become great among you shall be your servant. Whoever of you desires to be first shall be the slave of all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. This is Christ-oriented leadership through service. And actually, this works in the business world too. The more you serve your customers, the more authority you're going to get. The more you meet their needs, the better things are going to go. Jesus' way of leadership is actually, in some ways, pro-business. Because if you do good things for people and raise their value, they pay you. That's how that works. And servant leadership actually works in the business world. If you do a good job with hair, if you do a good job with printing, CPA stuff, whatever you guys are doing, people will reward you for that, for service. Service is what makes the world go around. And when we get that, we understand what true leadership is about. It's not about giving orders and being on top. It's about doing the best for other people. That's Jesus-oriented stuff. So basically, in Thessalonica, they're saying, who's your daddy? Are you going to be a Caesar leader or a Jesus leader? Now, you women may not understand this, but there's a pecking order in barbershops. The best barbers are by the door, and the worst barbers are by the bathroom. And they're all lined up, and they work their way up to the very top where the door is. And it's always worth waiting for that person, but that person got there by doing what? Giving the best haircuts and pleasing the customers the most. That's how that works. That's how you move up. That's how Jesus-oriented leadership is put together. John 18, then Pilate went back into his headquarters and called for Jesus to be brought to him. Are you the king of the Jews? In other words, are you the new Caesar? Are you the one in charge? Jesus rode into town, and basically, remember Hosanna, the big Hosanna, the king of, they wanted a Jewish Caesar. They wanted someone to, smack the Romans out and put their own rule in charge, and we're going to set up our own empire. Jesus says, no, I've got another plan. I've got a different way to be a leader. I've got a different way to be a man. I've got a different way to be an example, and I'm going to show you how to do that. Jesus replied, is this your own question, or did others tell you about me? Which is typical Jesus. He's always answering questions with questions. Am I a Jew? Pilate retorted. Your own people and their leading priests brought you to me for trial. Why? What have you done? Jesus answered, my kingdom is not an earthly kingdom. If it were, my followers would fight to keep me from being handed over to the Jewish leaders. They would fight to keep me in power. And sometimes, folks, when we have elections, guard against the thought where I want my Caesar in rather than their Caesar. because that sneaks in pretty fast. If we could just get our Caesar in there, then things will be good. But the truth is, we want servant leaders in charge, people who are serving the people who are there for us, people who serve the citizens. But my kingdom is not of this world. Pilate said, so you're a king? Jesus responded, you say I'm a king. Actually, I was born and came to the world to testify to the truth. And the truth is that we do have certain freedoms, and that domination is not the way to run the world. It's not the best way to do things. I was born and came into the world to testify to the truth. All who love the truth recognize that what I say is true. Jesus basically said the source of the universe is best described as Abba, as a father. Fatherhood. Romans 8:15. This is Paul writing, you've not received some spirit that makes you fearful slaves. Instead, you received God's Spirit when he adopted you as his own children. Now we call him Abba, Father. If the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed. Folks, it's about freedom and autonomy. A true father encourages autonomy, not slavery. A true father encourages development of the people younger than him. Doesn't try to get them to knuckle under to what he wants them to do. Now, there's good inclusive language and there's bad inclusive language. I want to talk about bad inclusive language. When you translate the Bible, many, if not most of the pastors I know, try to avoid the word he for God and try to talk around it and try to substitute father with something like father, mother. And they do this because, well, people had bad fathers and we shouldn't, and fatherhood is bad, so, and men are bad and men are stupid, as it says in this article. So let's demasculinize the Bible. And that's just really, it does great damage to the Bible. Because Jesus saw God as a father, a good father, a giving father, a father who protects, a father who encourages our independence and development, a father who wants us to become what we're created to be, not a father who dominates and runs everything and makes us do stuff. Ever notice there's a lot of sin in the world? Because God gave us free will, he doesn't make us do anything. People say, well, pray for my kid because my kid's off the rails. I'm saying, well, I'm going to pray for your kid. I'm going to do it because I think it makes a difference. But even God can't make your kid do certain things he doesn't want to do because God respects our humanity and wants, this is Father's Day. Who wants a Father's Day card that's coerced? Nobody wants that. We want voluntary things. Here's a bad inclusive language. This is from a recent Bible. It is God, the only child, who is close to the bosom of the father, mother. And that's in John 1:18, which does great disservice to the text. If Jesus wants to talk about God as Abba, who thinks Jesus is smarter than we are? And we should probably pay attention to what he thinks. I've heard people say, well, yeah, I believe in God, but I don't believe in the devil. Are you a Christian? Yeah. Well, Jesus believed in the devil. Do you think you're smarter than Jesus? You know, I throw those things around because Jesus had certain ways of seeing things. I try to see everything as best I can through the eyes of Jesus. Because in my mind, he's the head barber. And I want to see as he sees things as best I possibly can. Now, there's such a thing as good inclusive language. For instance, English is a lot more sexist than Greek or German. In Greek, the word anthropos means person. We get anthropology from that. And Shauna can stand up and say, ego eimi ho anthropos, I'm an anthropos. And so can Tom. It's often translated in English as man. We say, well, that means inclusive, but in a way it doesn't, because Tom can get up and say, I'm a man, but if Shauna said that, we'd all laugh, because she's not a man. It's not a good thing to say. For instance, in German, Martin Luther translated that Mensch as person. Anthropos, person, Mensch, person. English is often translated man, which is more sexist than the other languages. So it's probably best to say a person in English if you want to translate that correctly. So there's good inclusive language, and there's bad inclusive language, which tries to whitewash all the fatherhood away from God. But we had a pastor across the sidewalk here who would not use the pronoun he for God. And she was here for several years, and a lot of you met her. There's such a thing as toxic masculinity, and that's Caesarness, where you abuse, you make people do things, you force things. That's toxic. There's virtuous masculinity, and that's masculinity like Jesus had it. Servant masculinity, sacrificial masculinity, being the source of things. We're going to talk about that in just a second. There's such a thing as toxic femininity. If you don't believe me, go to a girl's dorm where gossip and character assassination are like the national sport. There is such a thing as toxic femininity. There's also such a thing as honorable femininity. So much of it in the Bible. Ruth, Esther, Mary, so many. You can't say virtuous, by the way. You can't be virtuous femininity because virtue is Latin for manliness. So you got to use a different word. So I put honorable in instead. So just throwing that in here. But certain denominations are run by Caesar-like things. And, well, there's the Roman. I'm not bashing Catholics. Catholics, there's a lot of Spirit-filled Catholics, Bible-believing Catholics, but the system is Roman. Hence we call it the Roman Catholic Church, and everybody in charge has to be a man. It's just men all the way up. That's how the Roman system works. And also the Southern Baptist Church, which just kicked out their best church. They just kicked out Saddleback because they've got a couple of associate pastors who are women. And this was the vote to kick out Saddleback just last week. 88.46 to kick them out, 11 to keep them in. This was the vote of the Southern Baptist Convention to do that. So this was reasserting Caesarness in the system. Never mind, there's no such thing as ordination in the New Testament. And there's no senior pastors. So they're fighting over something that isn't even in the Bible, let alone something that has a, never mind, that's just my little soapbox. You folks know that I'm willing to go to the line on egalitarian issues because I believe in spiritual gifts. And when someone has a spiritual gift, you have to let him or her use it. Because that's how God wired them to be. And if women can teach, women can teach. If women can, the Southern Baptist Convention that voted this thing, you can't be a senior pastor, but you can be a missionary and lead a whole nation to Christ in the mission field. But when you come back, you can't, well, never mind. I think, though, we need to celebrate virtuous masculinity. And we need to hold it up. Taking responsibility. Taking charge. Making sure things happen. Most men are between 40 and 60% stronger than equivalent females in upper body strength. That's just a simple biological fact. And we can reach higher shelves, and we can open jars, that kind of stuff. But that strength can be used for protection or abuse. And we have to teach our young people to use that strength to protect people who don't have the same upper body strength that you do, and the same voice that you do. There are times I've had to put on my wrestling coach voice in certain settings, at bus stops, locker rooms, where I've had to use that to get people into line, because they're starting to be abusive with other people. We need to protect people. If you see somebody pushing his girlfriend around, which happens downtown late at night when people have been drinking too much, you need to say something and speak up. If you see somebody hassling an older woman, that's something you need to take care of. And put yourself on I might get hurt, so what? What if Jesus said on the way to the cross, I might get hurt? We need to be able to put ourselves out there and protect people. We need to be the source. The Bible says we're to be the head of the family, and the head, the word is Rosh, and the word Rosh means source. We are to be the initiating source in the family. We need men, whether you're watching this online or here, You need to be the one that initiates the prayers in the family. You need to be the one who initiates church going in the family. The one who gets that stuff going, the initiator. Don't depend on the women in the house to do that. That's your job. And it's your job to bless the kids too. Blessing from an older man is incredibly powerful for people. If you have the blessing of an older man who really says you have what it takes and means it, you're going to go somewhere in life. To be able to bless people and guide people and be the source, initiating Christian involvement. In dancing, men lead. That's not to say they're the boss, but it's just the natural way of doing things. And it's up to, when you're dancing, for the wife to kind of stay in step as best she can with what he's trying to do. Ballroom dancing is that way because it's natural. And this is not Caesar bossiness, this is servanthood. Good male ballroom dancers are very affectionate, protective, and light on their feet with the women. It's not a bossy thing. Sacrifice of self, Ephesians 5:25 says that men ought to sacrifice themselves for their wives, to be expendable for your wife, to get out there and do whatever you have to do to make sure she's okay and taken care of. Ephesians 5:28 says we should love our wives as our own bodies. How's that for intense? You don't abuse your own body, Paul says. Don't abuse your wife. Very little to do with genetic paternity. This is true in the courts too. The fact that you're the biological father of someone means almost nothing legally. Almost nothing. You have almost no claim. If you biologically father a child and someone else takes care of that child and pays for things and everything else and supports and loves and does all that stuff, guess who the courts are going to say the father is? The person who does the father stuff. And they've always been that way. The courts give father rights to people who do the father stuff. It has almost nothing to do with biology. Those of you who've never been biological fathers can be fathers. In fact, it has almost nothing to do with who your biological father was. Well, my biological father didn't like me. Well, there's lots of people, lots of men who probably did. Think of Bible camp counselors or coaches or band directors or people who really were there for you as men. They're just as much fathers as anyone. Fatherhood is an equal opportunity employer for all men, much more so than motherhood. Mothers have a way bigger connection physically to the baby for obvious reasons. They carry it for 9 months and they nurse it and everything else. There's a real physical connection there that, folks, men can father anybody. You can love and support and take care of people that have nothing to do with you biologically. I'm wearing Wendy's dad's shoes. Just love that guy. I have no connection with him biologically. But he, in many ways, did a lot of fathering with me. I had a really good biological father for that matter, too. My college football coach was amazing in fathering. We've got people like that, and so I want to encourage all men to be fathers to anybody who's a little bit behind you in the caravan of life, because you can help them and encourage them and tell them that they have what it takes to do what they need to do. Very little to do with your genetic paternity. Here's 2 images of fatherhoods in America having to do with church. Here's one of them from Norman Rockwell, and you see the guy sitting there as the wife and the kids go off to church. We don't really have that problem so much here at the Well, but this happens a lot. They abdicate their leadership and their initiating to the other people in the family. Norman Rockwell also had a picture of how it should be, and that's how it should be. Being there, helping out, and this person doesn't have to be a biological father. This person can be anybody who protects, nurtures, encourages, and blesses. That's what fatherhood is all about. So here's some practicalities. Rather than trying to whitewash all the masculinity out of Jesus' language for God, dive into it. Why did he describe the creator of the universe as Abba? Dive into that and trust him as he calls him Father. And resist the attempts of people to kind of change that. Wendy and I, when we were in seminary, everybody was trying to change how we talked about God. And I resisted it, got in a lot of trouble. Ended up in the president's office a couple times because I would not take the masculinity out of God in the Bible, because that's what Jesus said. There's a goodness to fatherhood that we need to raise up. If you don't believe that's out there, trust me, it is. Resist misandric ideologies. You've heard of a misogynist? Misogynist is someone who doesn't like women. Misandry is people who hate men. And at the hard edge of the feminist movement, pretty much everything masculine is bad. Especially white masculinity. I mean, anything there is just awful. And just resist that and push back on it, because it is not of the Lord. To hate half the human race is not of the Lord, period. You see a baby boy just being born, well, here comes another abuser. I mean, that's ridiculous. Here comes a racist abuser. No, this is a baby. Don't be doing that. There's a lot of misandric stuff out there. This is a misandric article. I can't stand that. There's really good men out there, and we need to encourage those men to be good men and encourage all men to be Christ-like men, not Caesar-like men. Affirm virtuous masculinity wherever you see it. Wherever you see men being strong and sacrificial and giving and protective and helpful and blessing, encourage that. Break any curses from your background. If someone ever tells you, well, your father didn't like you, so the rest of your life is going to be terrible, don't buy it. There's lots of men in your life who've done great things for you. Be grateful for them. Like I say, it has very little to do with biology. If you're blessed to have had a biological father who loved you, that's great. But if you didn't, the Lord will put other people in your path, and the Lord will give other people the opportunity to bless you. Celebrate non-genetic father figures, people who were fathers. Think about those people today. John had a teacher at seminary or at Bible college, at Life Bible College, who was like that for you, who really walked you through some stuff. To celebrate people who did those things for us. Say thank you if they're still alive. I'm getting to the point where none of them are. I mean, there's just very few of them left. But still, if they are still alive, be grateful to them. Men, use your power of blessing lavishly. Men have a superpower. It's called blessing. And when you give your blessing to a younger person, a young man, a young woman, it makes a huge difference in their lives. They'll remember it for the rest of their lives. I believe you have what it takes, and I'm going to help you get there. That's big stuff. And you might say, I'm too young to do that. Folks, there's people behind you that you can bless and that you can encourage. A lot of older brothers have done that for siblings. Some just beat them up, but it can happen. John 1:12-13. But to all believed him and accepted him, he came the right to become the children of God, God the Father. They are reborn not with a physical birth resulting from human passion or plan, but a birth that comes from God. So you have this birth that is spiritual that comes from God. So what I'm laying out here is two forms of masculinity: dominating Caesarness and life-giving Christ-likeness. And I just want to encourage all the men within the sound of my voice to grow into that Christ-like, sacrificial, loving, blessing, strong, protective, initiating fatherhood. That's the biblical model. And that's the natural model that we were made to have. And we had for many generations until these emperors came by and put themselves in the place of Christ, which isn't right. We need to let Christ be Christ and do away with the Caesar model. Well, I'm going to invite the worship team up here. Next week, At the end of this story, Paul was there for all of 3 weeks, not much of a career in Thessalonica. And they basically put him on a bus and sent him down to Berea and just waved as he went away and hoping to have some peace. This is a pattern which will repeat itself many times, by the way. People generally, once they've had enough of the riots, they put Paul in a bus and send him off to the next town where he goes and starts another riot wherever he goes. So he's not afraid to be an initiator of really good stuff. Let's all stand and let's pray.